On Monday the 27th of May, Black Monday, that is the day that Britain comes closest to losing the war. By the end of the week, by the end of the Dunkirk evacuation, when not the 45,000 men that was expected to be lifted, in a best case scenario, 338,000 plus had been evacuated, then suddenly you're in a situation where actually complete meltdown and crisis has been averted, and actually suddenly the nation is pulling together and their strength is growing and their ability to hold out and to keep fighting and actually eventually possibly even overtake Germany in terms of strength is suddenly being realised. So that week is the pivotal week. Had Britain lost the war, then Germany, Nazi Germany, would have dominated the entire European continent as well as Great Britain, and their job in the Soviet Union might have been just that little bit easier. Well, for most of the Dunkirk evacuation, the British public wasn't aware that it was happening. It was only once they started coming back in droves that they started to realise, and there was a press embargo on this until I think something like the 30th of May, so well into the evacuation. And when the little ships were called out, I think on the night of the 28th of May, you know, the embargo was still in place. So the little sort of powered shallow draft boats all around East Anglia and southern Britain, they were called out, but, you know, please keep it under wraps. That was basically the message. The British public were really, really deeply shocked by the turn of events on the continent because no one expected the combined alliance of Britain and France, and then latterly, once the war began, once the Germans launched their attack, Holland and Belgium as well. They thought that would be enough. Now, there's a rule of thumb when you're attacking that you need at least 3-to-1 material advantage, and the Germans just didn't have anything like that. What they were able to do was bring to bear that important advantage at the main point of attack, what the Germans call the Schwerpunkt, this concentration of force. But overall, not at all. I mean, France alone had double the number of artillery pieces, had almost double the number of tanks. They had bigger, better tanks. I mean, you know, on paper, they shouldn't have lost. Where it was won by the Germans was in their speed of manoeuvre, their speed of operation, helped massively by the fact that the German people were, there were more radios in Germany per family than any other country in the world, including the United States. Mechanically, they were way down the list. They were kind of way behind France, way behind Britain, and certainly obviously way behind the USA. But in terms of radios, Germany had lots of them, and so they're able to harness that. And of course, if you have radios in your tanks, in your trucks, with your artillery, even with your groovy BMW motorbikes and sidecars, then you can all communicate with each other very quickly. I mean, that was the failing of the First World War, that people would exploit it, you know, would break through, but they couldn't exploit it because they couldn't communicate and get reinforcements. Now the Germans have done that. The French still don't have radios. They're stymied by this slow, methodical, top-heavy command structure. They don't have many radios, just a few. They're dependent on telephones and traditional telephone wires, which then get cut by bombing, by, you know, problems of war, and they just can't move. And the roads are being clogged by refugees. And what that means is units are being ordered by dispatch rider who are often getting lost. And by the time that order has reached the place it needs to be, other events have already moved. And so what's happening is the French forces are just stuck where they are. They're literally like rabbits in headlights. They cannot physically move. And what that means is the Germans can concentrate their best forces, which are a comparatively small spearhead to the long wooden shaft of the rest of the German army, and can take out those units in detail and basically envelop the whole lot. But no one was expecting that. So back in Britain, everyone is just absolutely gobsmacked by this turn of events. And you have to remember that people have been seeing the Nazis on newsreels, at the cinemas and so on, these huge Nuremberg rallies, and that all looks incredibly intimidating and scary. And so they've already been put on a kind of military pedestal that perhaps they don't deserve. And everything that happens in France just confirms their very, very worst fears. So there is general panic in Britain. And what happens during that Dunkirk week is they panic nearly so much that they throw in the towel. The driving force behind that is Lord Halifax, who is the Foreign Secretary, who is urging the War Cabinet to pursue peace talks through Signor Bastianini, who is the Italian ambassador to Britain. And had they done that, what Churchill realises, who is only 16 days into his premiership when Operation Dynamo, the evacuation, begins, what Churchill realises is that once you open that door, even just ajar, it then blows wide open and you can't shut it again. And you've already signed your death warrant, effectively. You've crossed the Rubicon of which there is no return. And he was absolutely right. But, you know, Halifax was the most respected politician in Britain. Churchill was recognised as being a maverick with quite unsound judgment. But actually, the irony is the man who was known to be steady, sound, you know, the absolute epitome of good sense was the one who was losing his head. And the one who had the reputation for being a maverick and unreliable was the one who was really keeping calm. And as he was able to defeat Halifax on the 28th of May and win over first the War Cabinet, the five-man War Cabinet, and then the Outer Cabinet, so Churchill's own strength was reinforced, and with it came the start of this wonderful oratory and his own self-confidence and his understanding, his geopolitical understanding of the wider situation was that, yes, the BEF has been defeated, but most of the men have come back, which is a psychological and morale-lifting victory, even though from the jaws of defeat. But also what Churchill recognised was that the British Army was a very, very small component in its armed services. The absolute number one senior service was the Royal Navy, which was really important because obviously we're an island nation. And second was the growing strength of the RAF. And the RAF was able to operate over Britain with the world's first fully coordinated air defence system, which is something that no one else had ever thought of doing. And no one else in the world had. So France didn't have it, and the RAF, when they were in France, didn't have that either. But they do when they're operating over Britain. This is a massive shock for the Luftwaffe and completely blunts them in the Battle of Britain. But Churchill realises that actually there's a lot in Britain's favour. The dominions, the empire, extra imperial possessions in South America, for example, Egypt, control of the Suez Canal, this huge navy, the world's largest merchant shipping navy, access to around 80-85% of the world's merchant shipping. You know, these are all colossal advantages. And yes, the very, very tiny army has been defeated, but sort of that doesn't matter in the big scheme of things, because we have the navy, we have access to resources, and we can grow our army, and we can fight back, we can rebuild our strength. As long as we can hold on now, we can rebuild our strength as German strength is diminished. Well, the little ship's contribution was significant because it showed this kind of, it bound people together and it became part of the legend. I mean, how many people they actually lifted, of course, you know, compared to, you know, a destroyer or a cross-channel ferry or something, you know, it's a tiny, tiny fraction. But so many people answered the call, and, you know, lots of them sacrificed their lives. And it became part of the myth. It became very, very quickly part of the myth. You know, everyone recognised what they had done. And from a morale point of view and psychologically, it helped bind Britain. It all became part of this, we're not going to be defeated, we might have our backs to the wall, but everyone can play their part. And it was this part, it played an incredibly important part in this concept of bringing the entire nation together. That this is not just about our armed services, this is about every man, woman and child in Britain pulling their weight. And these people, these civilians, answered the call. You are morally obliged, everybody else is morally obliged to do their bit as well. It really worked. So it's a psychological and moral advantage of what they achieved rather than the numbers of men that they were actually lifting off the beaches. But, you know, it's a fantastic story, isn't it?